I'm Greg Mundell, Senior Vice President with InfoZen, and it is my pleasure this morning to introduce our distinguished keynote speaker. The Honorable Paul Schneider is a principal with the Chertoff Group, where he counsels clients on budgeting, procurement, and overall management issues related to security programs. Prior to joining the Chertoff Group, Mr. Schneider was the Deputy Secretary for DHS. There he managed day-to-day operations of an organization with approximately 220,000 employees and an annual budget of $52 billion. Earlier as Undersecretary for Management, Mr. Schneider was responsible for the department's financial management and for the procurement and management of such mission-critical assets as information technology systems, facilities, and equipment. Prior to coming to DHS, Mr. Schneider served as a defense and aerospace consultant following a long and distinguished career in DoD, where his last three positions were Executive Director and Senior Civilian of the Naval Sea Systems Command, Senior Acquisition Executive of NSA, and Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Research, Development, and Acquisition, where he is responsible for the oversight and execution of Navy and Marine Corps research, development, and acquisition programs, with an annual budget in excess of $30 billion. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, the Honorable Paul Schneider.
Well, good morning, everybody. I got to tell you, I'm a humble retiree, and humble retirees don't get up at 5:30 in the morning to get down to the Reagan building. How many of you, frankly, are awake? That's good. That's good. I really appreciate that. Believe it or not, that in the discussion with some of the AFCEA folks beforehand, I'm probably one of the few people that will be a keynote speaker that's ever taken an AFCEA course. And I'll just kind of put, anybody here has taken an AFCEA course? Yeah, a couple, okay. Well, I got to tell you, they're really excellent. And if you find that you really need to get smart technically on a bunch of things, I've taken two of them, and they're just absolutely outstanding. So if there's a need, they have a source, and I don't get paid for FC or anything like that, but it's just a tremendous function that they provide that if you need it and you want to keep up to date with the technology, that's really the key way to go do it. I think that the theme of this conference, especially the last couple of words, doing more without more, is really kind of key to everything that's going on. It's been approximately 3 years, almost 3 years, since I left government and the Department of Homeland Security. And so since leaving that position, I've had a chance to really think about what the department does, my years of experience, and just kind of observations of what's happening relative to the fiscal reality of the world and other things. And frankly, trying to put in context those types of things that might be able to be done in order to do more without more. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. Very briefly on the threats, I think the serious dangers that face our nation today involve the biological, the cyber, and the nuclear threats. As you know, it's very, very difficult to convince the general public of the importance of these threats. I know DHS and the federal government takes these threats very seriously and has instituted many programs to address these dangers, but I'm concerned that in some cases the fiscal reality will actually limit the financial resources that are available to counter these threats. Just take a look at the 12 budget and the 13 budget that the President submitted to the Hill. And when you get down to the gory details, what you see is cuts here, here, and here. And that's just based on the fiscal reality. I think biological is at the top of the list, quite frankly, in my terms, because of the ease and accessibility of the materials and the know-how and the potential widespread consequences. Also, quite frankly, I think most people would agree that from the national preparedness standpoint, we're really not very well prepared to counter that. Cyber, and I'll talk a little bit about in a minute, and I appreciate the challenge that Jim gave you earlier about interacting with the panels later on today. What I'm going to cover is going to give you some stuff to think about. You may not necessarily agree with it, but you'll think about it, and it might help you frame some questions for the later discussions that happen today. Cyber, because of its pervasiveness and in actually being able to pinpoint the attribution of where there is attack, a hack, etc., I think has rapidly emerged as one of the most critical threats that we face today. Under former President Bush and then President Obama, the government is executing what was initially referred to as the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative. It's across government, but the major players are the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security. In reality, when you really get down to the details of the dollars, the focus to date and in the near future is centered on hardening the military networks and the .gov networks. This is not an insignificant challenge. And the reason for that, quite frankly, is while the military, DoD, has had a lot of that expertise over the years and has applied a lot of measures to secure the network, the .gov, on the other hand, if you take a look at the resources across the entire federal government, this just isn't DHS, this is Treasury, Agriculture, EPA, you name it. The fact of the matter is the requisite expertise that's available in-house, frankly, in my opinion, is not of the same caliber as the DoD has for years. And so this is not an insignificant challenge. It's not at the same level, and the scope of it is much greater. And so it's appropriate that the large sum of money over the past couple of years, and for 13, is focused on these networks. In a recent briefing to Congress about worldwide threats, the head of the FBI, Bob Mueller, said that the danger of cyber attacks will equal or surpass the danger of terrorism in the foreseeable future. And what makes this assessment particularly alarming to me is that the United States may be as unprepared to defend some of its critical computer systems as it was to protect New York and Washington on 9/11. The Pentagon and the DHS effort does not cover, for the most part, the domestic civilian economy, including the vital infrastructure systems such as electric power grid, water supplies, and the financial systems. Many of these computers that control these utilities lack the adequate security measures and really could be devastated by viruses that are launched either by hostile states or even hackers, as we've seen in the recent press over the couple of months. As it is, and a lot of this stuff is public, U.S. companies from defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, email carriers, Google, are under continual assault. And what's happening is these people that assault these organizations, they seek to steal industrial or national security secrets and probe for infrastructure weaknesses. When it's all said and done, this is just crime, using the internet as an enabler. Congress and, fortunately, Congress and the Obama administration have recognized this problem, and both have spent years studying it and have drawn up different proposals for hardening the cyber defenses. Senior legislators from both parties have committed themselves to passing legislation that will go counter these potential threats. Probably the most publicized legislation that has emerged is in the Senate under Senator Lieberman and Collins. It has a lot. It's a very big bill. It's got lots of provisions and updates to update outdated legislation, but its most important sections would provide for information sharing by the government and private companies and mandate better security for critical infrastructure. These areas are very contentious, make no mistake about it. So those that have been following this legislation realize that been a big occasion over the past couple of months about legislation regarding safeguarding internet piracy. So what's happened is that some of the net purists, in my words, have been announcing some of these provisions that would make it easier for companies to tell each other and the government about security breaches, and also about ways to go prevent them. The other thing that they are opposed to is mandated reporting in the case of security breaches. So I would acknowledge the fact that there may be legitimate civil liberty concerns, but in my view, it's absolutely essential that companies are able to share information about stolen data and other attacks without compromising privacy or exposing themselves to government sanctions. And so my standpoint is that the cooperation between the government and the private companies is badly needed in order to basically ensure protection of this critical infrastructure. The Senate legislation gives DHS, rather than the Pentagon, authority in this area, and lays out a system of defined actions that would focus on concern. And this concerns computer systems that, if they were attacked, would cause a mass casualty event, interruption of life-sustaining services, mass evacuations, or catastrophic economic damage to the United States. And so firms with such systems would be required to work with the government on a security plan and other provisions. Well, the Chamber of Commerce and several Republican senators have already objected to such authority, claiming it amounts to unnecessary and costly legislation. There are many other issues that factor into this. It's privacy. It's the revelation of attacks that might impact investor confidence and stock price. The impact on trade and economic growth if our trading partners do not think we are secure partners. You have then a bigger concern, if you think about it, and that's the competing regulatory committees regarding critical infrastructure protection. And this means you have the NERC and the FERC for the utilities, you've got the SEC for the financial. What happens with respect to invoking different standards, security requirements, and reporting? How do you reconcile those requirements with the standing oversight responsibilities and authorities of those committees today? The whole issue of intellectual espionage, it's criminal activity, how does it get handled? And you have serious liability issues. So it just seems to me that if you take a look at this and what's happened in the past couple of days, where the head of NSA was recently criticized, according to the paper, by the White House for basically saying that NSA really is the only one with the expertise that ought to have the responsibility and the authority to scan the networks of critical infrastructure. And just based on what the press says, the White House kind of said, not so fast, General. We have other ways to go do that. And so my bottom line is, while you see this rush with different legislations and different issues and things like that, my view is this, having been in the government a long time and understanding how the process works, this is much too complex to expect a timely or a comprehensive approach, just given how our system works. So I think the way to do this is reach a consensus on a piece of this that people can agree to, recognize it may be a quarter of the loaf, but then enact it, pass it. Recognize that you have to get at this problem, bite at the elephant at a time, and then move on to the next piece, which may be a little bit more contentious. If we're able to do that, which means settling for something less than a whole loaf, in my way of thinking, that would be a major accomplishment and the way to approach this problem in generally over the next couple of years. So, big question here today is, with all the money that goes into cybersecurity, the federal government, what does that mean to the average person in Central America? What does it actually mean to the small, mid-sized business? What does it mean for the state and local governments that have critical infrastructure? My simple way of looking at it is it doesn't mean much because you're not going to get much. So the fact of the matter is, you take a look at that industry and the dot-coms of the world, it seems to me that what we need to be doing is structuring some very key public-private partnerships in order to get on with securing the rest of the cyber world. I find it absolutely amazing that within 50 miles of this building, you have a nexus of expertise in cyber that's unmatched in this country or possibly the world. You've got the Fort Meade complex. You've got major cybersecurity centers that have been set up by the major corporations. These are hundreds upon hundreds of millions of dollars. You have cyber incubators in the state of Maryland. They're popping up all over the place. You have the University of Maryland has a cyber research and development center. I read 2 weeks ago the Potomac Institute has set up a cyber institute. It's the latest craze. But what I'm trying to figure out is, how does the mass of requirements get transmitted to the private sector where people, small companies got some very smart people coming up with some very interesting things? How does that get to them? How do the people that have stuff that can work get fed back to, I would use the term large system integrators and things like that, the contractors that run networks and things like that, and the smaller organizations that do this work in the state and local governments and in the small and mid-sized businesses. How does that stuff happen? How does that work get into them? It's not clear to me that it really works. So I would figure a way to come up with some of these very open IT portals that easily allow the government to convey its requirements, get responses, and figure a way to go make this stuff work. The normal contracting, small business methods and forums, they're really good, and a lot of these people try and do a good job, but the fact of the matter is it doesn't match the speed by which this technology changes. And in my way of thinking about it, there's just a tremendous amount of innovation and capability that's out there. One of the things I've had a chance to do over the past 3 years is both be on the boards of several companies. I do a lot of pro bono work. I work with a lot of these small individuals, and I see the frustration that they have where they really don't have the marketing, the business development, infrastructure, and overhead to go figure a way to go penetrate this. And so we've got to figure out a way using technology to go make that happen. I think we ought to be able to set up programs with small-sized businesses and state and local governments to share information. I really believe this can be done on a regional basis. I think if you take a look at what's happening with the grant processes in terms of putting them all together, I think you're going to see a wave in the future of whereby grants should be and could be used for protection of critical infrastructure because these are really kind of key threats. And I think if you take a look at public-private partnerships, I really think what we're looking at, in my view, in the future is private sector-run security operations, CSOCs, to enable security for those small and mid-sized businesses and certain public sector entities. It's almost like, my way of looking at it, it's like a cable TV fee-for-service business model for the future. And I was discussing this, I guess, last week sometime with some folks, and basically say, you know, my house has a little sign outside that says it's protected by a certain security agency. I don't understand why, if I go 5 years from now, that security agency or someone like it wouldn't be protecting my network. So I think we're able to go do something like that. And I think, quite frankly, there's a business model that certain companies in this country would find attractive and invest to go do that. I want to skip around a little bit. I want to talk about science and technology in the Department of Homeland Security. The budget cuts over the recent years that have been imposed on S&T by the Congress has led me to conclude that the whole nature of the science and technology effort in DHS has to change in order to reflect budget reality. I don't particularly like what's happened with the budget as an outsider, but I follow it, and I'm not happy about it, but it's reality. So if you take a look at the existing manpower levels, you take a look at the major laboratories that are funded by S&T, if you take a look at the university centers of excellence, there's very, very little funding that's left. Really is not. And that's reality, and that's not going to change. So my view is we have to change what's done with the money. So I think we've got to focus on test and evaluation to inform users of the right equipment and systems to deploy. I think we've got to work with the users to better understand the threat environment, some of the operational concepts that they might want to be using. I'm amazed where at least a week or two goes by where I don't read about some public and private institutions around the country buying stuff, stick them on buses, stick them on police cars and things like that. And it's not clear that any competent technical authority knows if the stuff's any good. It's really kind of simple. So people are marketing this stuff, people are buying this stuff, and it's not obvious to me the stuff works. And I think one of the things that we ought to be able to do is have an aggressive program, meet the user needs, come up with the standards for the devices that could be procured, not buy it themselves because DHS will never get the money and the appropriation to go do that, and use these threat-based standards as opposed to what industry, my words, is industry-based standards where they say, we think this is what it ought to be. Well, some of the sensors, detection systems, and the like need to be threat-based because they're not like your washing machine or the dryer, which could be industry-based. I think that the other thing I think you have to recognize is a big consumer of S&T is not the Department of Homeland Security. The big consumer is the state and local governments. And that's where that focus and that need needs to be factored into the resource allocation process. So one of the things I think we could do, quite frankly, is following the lead of the Department of Defense based on the war in Iraq and Afghanistan is basically putting teams of, I'll call it lab rats nicely, but FFRDCs from DOD and from DHS with some mission people, put them out in the mission spaces, and my simple words are let them innovate and create. That's what the Army did with Iraq relative to setting up what's called the Rapid Equipping Forces. And the realization is that if you're going to meet the needs of the warfighter, you've got to put people that are smart technically with the technology out there, make sure they understand the problems, come up with ideas, and then rapidly field it, and that's what they've done. If you take a look at what's happening now in terms of network integration enterprises and things like that, the old business models of let's come up with a requirement, let's go do this and that, and in many years you'll have a product delivered, that doesn't work anymore. So I think what we have to do is really follow the lead of the Department of Defense in some of these critical areas and do things faster, get the laboratory technology folks out there working, and then rapidly field solutions. I think if you take a look at the CIO and IT, I want to spend a little time talking about that because it's going to be a focus of discussion in this conference. I personally think that the Department of Homeland Security under the Undersecretary for Management and the Chief Information Officer has made the department the leader in the federal government in data center consolidation and the migration to the cloud. And I really think they ought to get tremendous credit for the kind of job that they're doing. Once you work in the department and you work with IT, what you really come to realize is that it is really one big massive IT system with many different operational users and with the bulk of the databases that are used interconnected to satisfy different program needs. So you have multiple users, multiple systems, but many of them are interdependent. So my way of looking at it is whether it's E-Verify, US Visit, Text, and TTAC with all of its component systems. Many of these things are absolute real-time, like Secure Flight. They all have to come together in order for the government at various points adjudicate whether or not some person is the right person to come into this country or get certain rights. Yet, when you look at this on the outside, as I have, the different system modifications, the modernizations, and the upgrades are really executed by the individual components that happen to be responsible for their particular system and programs. And so while coordination and oversight can really be effective, I think that the current business environment dictates a different business model for streamlined command and control. I've watched and have been appalled by the last 3 years of the budget by the hundreds of millions of dollars that have been taken out of IT, both at the headquarters, the CIO, and then when you get down to the individual budget lines across the operating components, the operating components. What we're talking about here is hundreds of millions of dollars. And my view is the IT area will continue to sustain large financial cuts, due in part because people believe, well, IT is an enabler. So if you do more with IT, you ought to achieve more efficiency, so we're going to take that cut now, and you're going to have to go work for it. That's the way it actually happens, by the way. I agree that IT is an enabler, but the business management model itself that governs how the IT gets used and implemented is as much as an enabler as the technology itself. And the reason I say that is this. A lot of people look at the large amount of money that goes to the Department of Homeland Security and say, wow, that is a lot of money. So my simple way of looking at it, and I'm an engineer, so I know how to do math, it really kind of goes like this. If I add up all the salaries of the people, of the 220,000 people, throw a couple of $1 billion in for FEMA for disaster relief fund, throw a couple of billion here for grants, figure out how much I have to spend for rent that's across the department. That's close to about 75, maybe even higher % of the budget, okay? I mean, that's what we're talking about. That's right off the top of the head. The good news is the Congress has been very helpful in gradually increasing the level of operational law enforcement people in the department, but they've also cut the non-pointy end of the spear people. If you take a look at the amount of discretionary funds that's left, let's call it maybe 25%, okay? The majority of that is IT. So when you start taking a wax of hundreds of millions of dollars a year out of that, you are cutting bone. And so that's why I recommend doing the following. I really think it's time to consolidate all of the IT funding and the IT execution authority directly under the CIO. I think it's important to empower the CIO and the Undersecretary for Management to determine how best to incrementally phase in a new IT infrastructure, building on what they've done with data center migration and cloud migration. I think they need to use the funds, taking a look at a rack and stack of priorities. Don't just let this program go off and upgrade and modernize. If on an interconnected system, the effort over here is more needy of the funds. And I think they're able to do that. These are very smart people that run this organization. They have the capability, they have the know-how, and in my way of thinking, this is the ideal first step in doing more without more. Then, once you do that, you build on something that people that are professionals in this business know, but others don't want to hear, and that is institute a comprehensive managed services architecture across the department on the single IT system. This would truly aid in furthering the need to have one DHS. Next thing I want to talk about is changing the business model for scanning and screening systems. Scanning and screening systems are really a key element of what's needed for an essential part of security architecture. And if you take a look at what's happening in the medical community, that's where a lot of the advances come. If you take a look at what's happening with nanotechnology and things like that, that's going to further increase the capability of these systems. Right now, these systems are procured by several different organizations within DHS, and they're owned and operated owned by the government. So when they reach the end of their useful life, there has to be money in the budget to go replace them. Given the funding realities that we're faced with, and the speed by which the commercial sector can develop and respond, this calls for changing the business model. When I was the undersecretary, my predecessor as deputy secretary always realized that this was something that needed to be done. And the reason is he recognized quickly that the federal government would never get the money to be able to field, maintain, upgrade, refresh systems forever. And he was like Don Quixote chasing that windmill in dealing with the Office of Management and Budget. Because I got to tell you, I think he was right on. This had to do with basically a leasing business model versus a procurement business model. Well, they fought him tooth and nail, but he got me interested in this thing, so I took on the battle also. So I got on the horse, charged the windmill, and I did that for a while, and I realized I was getting nowhere. And so my way of thinking is this has to do with interpretation of capital lease versus operating lease and things like that. The fact of the matter is this: the world's changing, the fiscal reality is changing, the business model ought to change, and this is an area where I think potentially we got ways to do things better. The next thing I want to talk about is consolidating operations. I used to testify on the Hill a lot. I testified about once a month, sometimes more than that. In fact, one day I testified once in the morning and once in the afternoon. And those members of the committee that knew I was a former DOD employee and they had worked in the Department of Defense, they always used to ask me the question when we would be sitting either before the hearing or after the hearing, say, hey, Paul, isn't it time for a Goldwater-Nichols type of legislation for the Department of Homeland Security? And the reason is because they knew I lived in that world. For those that don't know, what Goldwater-Nichols did was it made sweeping changes to the department, the most sweeping since the Department of Defense was formed in 1947. It changed the command structure whereby the service chiefs didn't fight the war, you set up combatant commanders. And that was a tough thing for a lot of organizations to accept, but frankly, that's how we fight today. That's why you have a CENTCOM, a PACOM, a SOUTHCOM, et cetera, et cetera. It was subsequently followed by a Defense Management Review in 1989, which fully implemented the Packard Commission's recommendations and really streamlined the acquisition structure of the Department of Defense. I used to always reply when I was asked about this. I would say, well, it's probably the right thing to do, but not now. And the reason it's not now is this is an operational law enforcement organization. The second largest operational law enforcement organization clearly in the country, if not the world. And so I said, what we have to figure out is the right time to go do it. Well, at this particular point in time, I think the time is right to do it. And the reason for it is, when you have the job that I've had, what you really come to the conclusion of afterwards is there really is no unified command structure for DHS operational components in the field. Each component has different field structures, geographic boundaries, et cetera, et cetera. And these authorities really don't converge until you get to the secretary or the deputy secretary. So from a practical standpoint, what you have is independent operating components in the field. And I know there's several different informal arrangements and things like that people work at, much to their credit because of the dedication and commitment. But that is not the same as an integrated command and control structure. So I really recommend that we take a look at the future. We really need to have a unified field structure with appropriate command and control authority. I think it would provide greater stability, better interfaces with the Department of Defense and state and local, and there's different ways to go do that. I'm also aware, I'm a realist, that certain operating statutory authorities would need to be tweaked a little bit to go do that. But in my way of looking at it is the integration of the assets that the government has in this budget-constrained environment at the pointy end of the spear is absolutely essential in order to maximize the effectiveness of the organization. I think the second element of a Goldwater-Nichols type move would have to be to examine centralizing major acquisition programs in a DoD systems command type of a structure that are separate from the operating components. This would enable the operating components to focus on operations and build a critical acquisition mass using the resources that are currently available, because let's face it, they're not going to get bigger. And it ensures that some of the major cross-component acquisition initiatives and interoperability concerns get fully integrated and executed in a smart manner. The DoD learned this a long time ago, and my way of looking at it is really pretty simple. This building is the headquarters of Customs and Border Protection. That's a organization of 65,000 people. The majority of those people wear badges and carry guns, and they do a hell of a job. So, I got two questions that I asked myself. Number one, is it smart to hold the head of CBP, who's responsible for 24/7 law enforcement around the world, at the same time ask him to be responsible for developing and fielding complex systems that must integrate and work with other systems? The answer to me is no. Then the second question is this the correct model for the future? The answer is no. And that's why I think it's time for a different type of structure. The Department of Defense, they learned this a long time ago. That's why the Navy has an organization called Command of Submarine Force Atlantic Fleet. Vice Admiral, he operates submarines, but he doesn't have the responsibility for building Virginia-class submarines. The Air Force has an organization down in Langley, Virginia called the Air Combat Command. They operate fighter aircraft, but they do not acquire the F-22 or the F-35. Now, I'm smart enough and much of a realist as possible to know many organizations within the department will disagree with these recommendations, and they'll argue vociferously, I've been there, against any changes to the status quo that would protect their legacy functions and their independence. And so it would clearly be a challenge of leadership to steer these changes. But I think it's time to make some of these hard decisions given this budget reality. The days that I was fortunate to benefit from were over a 5-year period, the real budget increased by about 40%, are long gone. Now we're headed downward. It's just a question of how it gets done. Last thing I want to talk about is something that is kind of timely since Jim talked about it. You're going to get lots of reps from the different federal government agencies here. I think that's very important. I got to tell you that there's issues of ambiguities and overlaps regarding the assignment and interpretation of Homeland Security roles across the federal government. And in my way of looking at it, and I'll give you a couple, it's an obstacle. And it's an obstacle to the most efficient operations possible. And so I'm aware this is very political, it's very, it gets emotional. Administrations don't want to go further than perhaps they have. Congress certainly would be in a food fight over that like you've never imagined. But the fact of the matter is there are some issues. For example, DHS and DOJ regarding terrorism prevention and borders. If you work in this business and you're in the field, or if you're in Mexico, or if you're in London, or if you're in Hong Kong, you understand this, you see this. Department of Homeland Security and HHS regarding biological mass casualty event preparedness and response. Who does what, who's in charge, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's an issue. The DHS and the DOD regarding catastrophic response in terms of who supports to civil authorities. Trust me on this one, that's an issue. And so the challenge is that the agencies and these organizations would rather live with and work around these ambiguities than risk losing equities that they consider vital. Well, I have a problem with that. And so I think when you look to the future, these are those types of areas that really need to be addressed. Some independent organization without, quote, equities in this needs to go take a look at this in a really disciplined systems approach and figure out once and for all how to go resolve this. So I'd like to conclude by saying I think the department has really come a long way. I think it's going to get better and better over the years. These are very, very tough jobs that these people have. The people that work in this department are some of the most dedicated, committed people you'll ever want to work with. I think as we look to the future, if we're able to make some of these changes, which I've talked about today, I think we could do things more efficiently, do more without getting more. My way of looking at it is they're all hard, they're all doable, they will all enable progress. And I think really it gives you enough food for thought about some questions for the later discussions today and tomorrow. So I want to thank you for participating in this conference. I really appreciate the support that you give AFCEA and that you give the 220,000 people that work in the Department of Homeland Security who really dedicate themselves to keeping our country secure. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Thank you very much. Do you have time for? No.